People will probably be drifting in for a little while, but we'll get things rolling along. Glad to see everyone here tonight. It's always encouraging to see people from our town turn out to support us. Okay, we're all getting seated. I'd like to welcome everyone here on behalf of Save Our State, and I'd like to introduce a few of the key people who have been working real hard. Nancy Seitz, right here. Lisa Powers, Ginger Nelson, Jack Oliveri from our Norfolk CAC. We also have Chris Polsoni and Alex Vispoli from a CAC, and Marilyn Morris is somewhere here. All have worked hard. And our guest speaker, Marco Kaltosen, who has the flu. So we're going to rush along and hope that he makes it through. I think most of you, hopefully all of you, received a slip of paper as you came in a flyer. The purpose of the paper was to hopefully have you jot down some questions you may have as we go through the evening. If you would like to put your name and address on it, and when you're finished with it, we'll collect it and we'll have your name forever. And perhaps get in touch with you at some point in time when we need some help. You can also think about maybe some special skills that you may have, be it computer skills or whatever, that you could offer us when we need that kind of help. You never know what kind of vast array of skills you may have that we may need. And you also received a flyer, and we will talk about that in a little while. Before we get things actually moving, I'd like to introduce Frank Woodward and Joanne Sprague, who are both here tonight, and our congratulations to both of you. We look forward to continued support.
Thank you for inviting me, Sue.
You're welcome, Joanne. Thank you for coming. And Frank?
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to start off by quoting our Secretary of Environmental Affairs, John DeVillers, a recent program on Channel 4 entitled Cape Cod, Boom to Bust. Quote, landfills are the single greatest contributor to pollution. Something to keep in mind. In that line, I will introduce Marco Kaltosen. Marco is the director of the National Toxics Campaign. He has a graduate degree in chemical engineering and has worked in the field for the past 10 years. And he is an expert consultant working with our town of Norfolk and Walpole in the analysis of the Boston Harbor sludge. And he's here tonight to talk to us about the most recent analysis of the sludge. So I'll let him get going, and while he's talking, please think of your questions, and we'll get to those later. Just one more thing. After Marco is finished talking, we just have a few brief things that we'd like to share with you. So please don't leave when he's finished. We just have a couple things we'd like to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. First of all, if I'm an expert consultant, that must mean I'm getting paid for this.
Yeah.
This is news to me. Well, when I start talking about this project, I'm always a little bit torn. Which of the many fun things should I talk about first? Should I talk about sewage sludge, or should I talk about landfill leachate? Not normally exciting topics, not normally on everyone's mind, and very understandable. You don't really deal in these issues until you're forced to. And unfortunately, all of the communities that surround the landfill project that's intended for receiving waste materials from the MWRA really do need to think about it. And probably the single most important reason is, and I know everyone's heard this before, so please excuse me for repeating, all landfills leak, period. No questions, no buts. Everyone agrees. No one disagrees. It doesn't need to be proven. It's not an open question. No one has to decide. You don't have to take a poll. No more studies are required. All landfills leak. The EPA agrees that all landfills leak. Landfill builders agree that yes, landfills will leak. Landfill designers agree that even theoretically all landfills must leak. So how do you protect yourself from a landfill that is undoubtedly going to leak? Well, this is of course where all the different types of disagreements come in. The biggest disagreement of all comes around the idea of risk assessment. Back in the 70s, when we first started to write environmental legislation under the Nixon administration, the first issues that came to the fore were related to pesticides. What kinds of damage is the use of pesticide doing to the economy and to the health of the public? And the decision was made at the time that since there are several hundred pesticidal chemicals in use, that it's impossible to, once you use them, pull them back from the food products they're being used on. rather than legislate this industry out of existence, we'll set an acceptable risk level for the use of pesticides. The risk level that was considered acceptable is 1 cancer death in a million from exposure to pesticides. So already we decided that we wouldn't try and look for the safest method that we could possibly use to protect the public. We would find the level of acceptable risk that we all could live with. The problems with acceptable risk, of course, many. 1 cancer death in a million. In Massachusetts, that's 5 people a year being killed by the use of, say, a pesticide on bananas. Of course, that same method of risk assessment assumed that there are no other cancer risks out there. That your only risk is going to be, say, the pesticide called Captan used on bananas, the pesticide called Benefin used on tomatoes, that's another 5, and so on. And when you start mixing all these hundreds of chemicals and hundreds of different food products, it became readily apparent after a short time that risk assessment wasn't really protecting the public, that many hundreds of people per million were getting cancer from exposure to pesticides. But the die had been cast. The 1 in a million risk level had been used, had been put in place, and that was pretty much it in terms of debate. We haven't changed much since the early 70s in deciding what is a risk that we will allow people to be exposed to from a public project or from the use of a chemical and so on. And of course, that kind of risk assessment has been used fully in trying to decide whether a particular landfill project is going to be reasonable, feasible, and containing adequate safeguards. That the same assumptions are being made, that there are no other exposures from chemicals to the community, that we're going to look at 1 chemical at a time, that we're going to assume each person is exposed from just one way, just breathing, just drinking water, and so on. So when it's all over, and a project has been deemed acceptable and safe, we really have no guarantee that all those different toxic materials out there in the environment are not going to cause us a lot more harm than we ever anticipated. We haven't even begun to talk about things like margins of error, where risk assessments have been found to be off by a factor of 100 or even 1,000 times under certain conditions. And of course, not always in our favor, usually just the opposite. Usually people have erred on the side of neglecting the public health in these risk assessments. So what I'm trying to do is get people to be comfortable with the idea that risk assessments don't work to safeguard the public, therefore they must work to do something else. Well, risk assessments are very useful because they help people get all kinds of projects that are not necessarily safe for a community passed. Now imagine you're John DeVillers. Granted, you may be looking at unemployment in a couple of months, but you're the Secretary of the Environment for the state of Massachusetts. Someone comes up to you with a project. Now, when they ask for a state permit, they're not asking for the state to give the blessing for this project. They're not asking the state to say, this is a good project, we need this is something that's going to be useful for the Commonwealth. What they're asking is there a law on the books that forces you to not approve this project? Does this project violate the law? Well, it doesn't take very long for most people to realize when they look at a project proposal for any landfill that 99.9% of them don't actually violate the letter of the law. Therefore, the permit is really just a rubber stamp. So if risk assessment isn't going to protect the public, and the state is not going to protect the public, the law is not really sufficiently complex to take in many of these environmental issues, and that doesn't protect the public. What's left? Well, I guess you have to depend at this point on, I suppose, the MWRA to protect the public. Now, I'm sure that there's no one at the MWRA who's actually an evil person. I'm sure that there's no greater number of incompetent people at the MWRA than anywhere else in a massive bureaucracy. But one thing that's certain, the MWRA is under court order to dispose of what they call water pollution control residuals. Some people call it sludge, grit, or various 4-letter words. But they're under court order to get rid of it. And nice people, smart people or not, they've got a place in mind where they want to dump it. So all they're going to do is make sure that they're complying with this court order and with the letter of the law, and that that part of the project goes smoothly. So really, as much as I don't like to think so, we really can't rely on the MWRA to protect our safety. Well, backtrack a little bit. Given that all landfills leak, given that so many university professors, government officials, and so on say they're all going to leak, what's your protection going to be? Well, one of the best protections is put the landfill somewhere where no one's going to be impacted, where if it leaks, who cares? What's going to happen? Well, I guess the only landfill that I can think of that follows that kind of idea would be the low-level nuclear waste landfill that was proposed for New Hampshire. No, it may not be Massachusetts, but that doesn't quite count as in the middle of nowhere. How about the high-level nuclear waste facility down in Nevada? It's going to be built in a salt mine. It's going to be built 1,000 feet underground. I think there are 3 people who live within 10 miles of the salt mine. But despite the fact that there's no impacted area where people live, the environmental impact statements still have that 1 in a million risk level. Somehow they're just bumping up against the legal limit on how many people they're allowed to murder every year with this project. So given that we don't have vast areas of useless wasteland in Massachusetts like Nevada, where they still didn't quite get it right, we can't find this no impact area anywhere. The last measure of support, I suppose, comes from the idea of burying only inert materials in the landfill. If the landfill's guaranteed to leak, if there's no way to get away from an impact area, if you put something in the landfill that was so innocuous it wouldn't matter when it got out into your groundwater, wouldn't matter when the odors evaporate and get into the air and are breathed by people in the area, well then I guess it'd be okay. And here's where this proposal really falls apart. The National Toxics Campaign does maintain a laboratory for testing materials like sludge and grit and pellets, and we've done all these things. But it's the laboratories that have been used by the MWRA itself that are probably the most telling. These laboratories have found more than 100 different toxic organic chemicals, many of which are known carcinogens in sewage sludge. The same laboratories have found with every single test performed that the sludge, the grit, the pellets, the scum, what have you, all contain toxic metals. Metals like cadmium, which is a carcinogen. Metals like lead, which is known to damage the central nervous system. Excuse me. Metals like chromium, which under certain circumstances can be a carcinogen, which causes dermatitis. And a whole length of other materials. Mercury, which is a vicious, vicious destroyer of the neuromuscular system. These materials are in the sludge pellets. They're in all these products. If they're in the landfill, they're going to get past this plastic liner. They're going to get past this clay liner. They're going to be on the groundwater eventually. Maybe it'll be 1 year. Maybe it'll be 3 years. It's been my experience from looking at more than 200 landfills in more than 40 states in this great country, that it's usually in the range of 1 to 10 years after the landfill's installed that leaks are detected. And that really means that the leaks had to have started on the very first day when that landfill was constructed. I don't know if people have seen this far too many times already from the MWRA's presentations, but how do you describe what a landfill is? I mean, all the good parts are underground. They're hard to see. I guess you have to picture a bathtub made out of a hefty bag. And you fill that bathtub with all of your waste, and it starts to fill up with that marvelous landfill soup or juice or whatever called leachate that's mixed from water in the sludge materials, from rainwater, from groundwater that's getting into the site, and from this particular site, excuse me, a lot of surface waters as well. When it comes in contact with the toxic materials in the sludge, out it comes, and just like this hefty bag, you might imagine somehow installing a plastic liner that covers so many acres, there's going to be a little bit of a hole somewhere. Imagine the tiniest hole, a little hole, almost visible, a pinhole, 1/8 of an inch. If the leachate were to build up just 2 feet above the bottom of the liner, 2 feet. Now, we're not talking the 120 feet that this landfill could eventually get to, but just 2 feet. 1 pinhole, 1/8 of an inch across. Little hydrodynamics shows that that will give you, on average, about 25,000 gallons a year of leachate. Now, when Professor Brown from the University of Texas did a study on landfill liners, these plastic liners, of course, they don't come in one great big piece. They come in long, long strips that are unrolled, and you use something like a steam iron to bind those seams together. Now, on average, every 300 feet of landfill liner seam that's installed, you're going to have 1/8 inch pinhole. This doesn't count all the abrasions. You know, if you have a little piece of plastic spread on the ground, you can imagine it's not really good for it to drive a bulldozer over it, for instance, or catch a bulldozer blade in it, or if there's a frost heave or some other kind of structural damage that happens with this liner, the hole's going to be an awful lot bigger than 1/8 of an inch. So again, this landfill juice, this is the leachate containing all the toxics, has an easy way of getting out of this landfill and out into the environment. But there is another line of defense. For this system, the MWRA will install a series of monitoring wells. These are just water withdrawal wells all around the landfill. And when the landfill leaks, and they start finding the toxic chemicals in the monitoring wells, they'll say, yep, it leaks. What exactly happened then? Well, according to the project managers, nothing. If it's leaking, there is no obligation on the part of the MWRA to immediately cease disposing of these toxic materials into the landfill. The MWRA has been asked to indemnify the towns that get water from this landfill, asking simply that if this landfill were to contaminate our groundwater supply, which you say could never happen, but if it did, would you give us an alternate water supply without cost? The MWRA says absolutely not. I guess that's asking someone to put their money where their mouth is. This, I think, is an important indication that people do anticipate the landfill is going to leak. Again, where does the protection come from in this project? If it doesn't come from the MWRA, if it doesn't come from the state, if it doesn't come from the law, if it doesn't come from the kind of material that's being disposed of, that is, it's not inert, it contains a lot of toxics, there's only one group left, and that's the people in Norfolk, or the people in Walpole, who have to take the time before a landfill is built to decide for themselves whether or not this is a project that they feel comfortable with, whether or not they feel this is a project that's going to be good for the community, and whether or not they really believe that the MWRA has truly looked at every way of either eliminating the need for landfilling sludge, which they haven't promised, truly protecting the public in terms of landfilling materials by getting all of the toxics out, or even the basic step of being willing to indemnify people for their losses should health effects, should damage to the water supply begin to show up. Since those things aren't being done, I think it's important that people take the time and learn a little bit more about this project and consider what happened today for the people in the city of Braintree. Braintree, Massachusetts is an urban area that already has seen more than its share of toxic pollution, just like this area perhaps has more than its share of unusual, we'll call them, land uses. The city of Braintree really supported its citizens. The people were out there in the streets. They weren't politely asking, please, Mr. DeVillers, don't give us an incinerator. They were saying, no, no way, this is not going to happen. They were out in the streets. They made sure that their representatives understood exactly what their demands were and took them back to the bodies where they deliberated and made it a statewide issue, not just a local issue. They were not willing to settle for 1 in a million deaths from any project for any reason. And today they won. And I hope that soon enough the same group can win in the same fashion. Thank you.
questions, if anyone has something they'd like to ask, please feel free. No one?
I have
Alec? I'm sorry. Larry?
a simple question. I understand that there's been a high degree of learning disabilities being discovered where the waters have become polluted in the area, so.
Yeah, that's a relatively new area of study right now. One of the things that's very difficult for communities that are near a disposal site for toxic materials or near a major emitter of toxic air pollutants, it's very hard to pick up the so-called excess cancer deaths out of the background, simply because there's so many different things that can cause cancer in industrial societies. But maybe even more disturbing than the outright deaths has been just a trickle of information that learning disabilities and other mental disorders are related to toxic exposures from waste disposal facilities. And that information is relatively new, and it points out the need to err on the side of safety in every case when one considers a project, to really decide whether or not you have erred in favor of the public wherever there's a scientific disagreement.
What was the final piece of information that enabled Braintree to block the incinerator?
What really did it more than anything else was that the site that was originally chosen was chosen because the company thought it might be grandfathered, that they might be able to use that facility because it had been a pre-existing waste disposal site. What had never been considered by the company was that they picked an area where there were just a lot of people living, where there were high schools nearby, nursing homes, hospitals. And the state decided that they couldn't guarantee that the acceptable 1 in a million deaths could be guaranteed. That really threw it out. They thought too many people would be impacted. Yes, sir.
Infiltration of leachants in the water, the only source of contamination. What about evaporated?
Well, that's actually a very important point. A lot of chemicals, especially things like solvents that are used by the high-tech industries, the computer industries in particular, tend to evaporate very, very quickly. Now, when this material decays in the landfill, it's going to create a lot of gas, marsh gas, methane, whatever you want to call it. That methane will tend to pull out the other readily evaporating volatile solvents, and it will create an air quality problem. Again, it's been subject to that 1 in a million deaths per chemical per project and so on kind of risk assessment. But it's very difficult to say what the actual impact will be of exposure to a lot of different chemicals simultaneously. Yes, sir?
So essentially, we're having two possibilities that could cause major concern. What is evaporated in the atmosphere, obviously causing a hazardous environment around our homes and our schools. And two is the infiltration of leachants into the ground and into our water.
And I'd probably add a third, because the ultimate source of a lot of these toxic materials are some of the local industries. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. 95% of the businesses that use the MWRA sewer system do so cleanly without disposing of toxic materials. But about 5%, and maybe even only 50 of the worst of that 5%, dispose of a relatively high number of toxics. Paul Levy, the executive director of the MWRA, has estimated last year that more than half of the toxics, and we think the numbers were a little bit higher based on our testing, but more than half come from this small number of industries. Consider too that those who live surrounding those industries are going to be exposed to the same air emissions that people living near the landfill will be exposed to. There'll be the transport difficulties, there'll be the people who work in those facilities. So you get this multifaceted exposure to toxics. If one were to eliminate or reduce the use of toxics in a lot of those industries, you'd have a lot of different things happening at once: reducing toxics transport, reducing toxic emissions from the landfill to the air, to the groundwater, reducing workers and residents' exposure at the plant site itself. So there are a lot of ways you can handle that one.
The point I was trying to achieve is that you mentioned earlier about risk assessment. And you mentioned that everything has been looked in order to comply with the letter of the law. You also said that a lot of the criteria that we're looking for in terms of the risks associated with the towns of Norfolk and Walpole and surrounding towns is that there is going to be some leachage going into the ground and eventually into the water.
That's right.
What we have here is a risk assessment that not only we're faced with hazardous environmental concerns in our air that we breathe, but also the water that we are going to drink. If we're to assess the risk, there are towns that they do not take their water from the ground neighboring the site as we do here. Therefore, if the landfill was located in a town that did not have that risk, the risk of drinking carcinogens into their water will not be there because they take their water from the Quabbin Reservoir. So what I'm trying to point out to you is that we are affected in a far more difficult way than the towns that they do not take their water from within the ground as we do. Therefore, the risk assessment really hasn't been assessed correctly. What they should look is, they should look not only at the environment in the air, but they should also look at the water.
Yeah, you bring up a point that I made a minute ago, I hope I made, that a lot of these sites are chosen not because they're the best site, but because it's practical in some other way. Not in terms of public health, but it's feasible for economic or political reasons. So you can never say that a project site is the best one. In this case, there are aspects of the project that simply don't work anywhere, especially since the MWRA has refused to rule out the disposal of day-to-day, the 200 million, I'm sorry, it's the flu talking, the 200 dry tons a day of sludge. Now, dry tons means you've taken all the water out of the sludge, and if I can use a little bit of an aid here. This is a sample of sewage sludge from the Deer Island treatment plant. I don't know if people can really see, but it's almost all water. Despite the fact that it's almost all water, it still contains about 10 times more toxic materials per pound than the original sewage does. Now, this material, which is 95, 96, 97% water, you take out the water, and now you're talking 100 times, 1,000 times more toxics per pound. 200 tons a day. Obviously, there is no good place to put 200 tons a day of material contaminated with that many toxics. So the issue is even broader than not just here, but not just anywhere. It's just the double misfortune of this site that it turned out to be practical in one sense, but it's sitting down right on top of the town's water supply.
What happens to the river where this thing starts to leak? We're looking at 38 public wells between the site and its entry into the Boston Harbor and the Charles River.
Well, right now, the Charles River receives a lot of sewage inputs from some of the smaller communities on the Upper Charles. There aren't very many toxics in those discharges. There isn't an awful lot of heavy industry on the Charles right now. Maybe that's a good example of what could happen with the MWRA system if they got some of the heavier industries to deal with their own waste rather than put it into the whole system. But anyway, because of the lack of a lot of these heavy industries, the Charles is relatively pristine in terms of toxics. We test the Charles River about once a month for toxic materials, and we haven't really found anything to speak of in a year of regular testing. That might change once the landfill is situated, because this landfill is on a groundwater recharge area. That is, the groundwater aquifers that contain all of our drinking water are being recharged from the same site where the landfill is going to sit. And most of these aquifers are very shallow, and they feed into the Charles River eventually. The towns of Natick, Wellesley, Needham, and Dover are very shortly going to be adding several new wells to the Charles River a few miles downstream of this point. We might very well start seeing detectable levels of toxins and expand the impact area in terms of public health.
Mark, we're a fairly small community and got a lot of voter turnout. Could you suggest
suggest, we've been fairly polite in our disagreement with the MWRA. Could you suggest any other tactics that might be useful for our neighborhood?
Well, I can imagine there are quite a few. You bring up an important issue, that is politeness. One of the things that those who want to put together these, I've heard them called LULUs, locally undesirable land uses, a lot of things that are counted on include the politeness of the town that's going to receive the LULU. They're hoping that people will be polite and maybe sign a few petitions, talk to a representative, maybe picket once or twice. These are all good things, but in isolation, they're not going to do the job. You need to look at a very wide range of tactics that are designed to expand awareness of the project within the community and outside the community. You need to identify key decision makers, political leaders, economic leaders. Start looking for powerful allies. Consider tactics that will make it difficult or embarrassing for project proponents to continue. There are literally hundreds of ways, but what they all involve is a significant number of people in the community being involved, staying involved, sharing the burden, not just having Susan or anyone else run the whole show all the time, but in a coordinated fashion, identifying weak points, designing a strategy to meet the goal of stopping the project. And once you have your strategies down, then you can start looking at individual tactics that are ranged from, well, let's see, a group in Maine went to visit their state environmental protection representatives. They all brought their children. They came in on a hot summer's day, and all the kids were eating these huge chocolate bars. And when the meeting was over, the entire office was just, everything was covered with chocolate. Files were covered with chocolate, file cabinets, sheetrock was covered with chocolate, desks, chairs. It was just an interesting reminder how even benign substances can be hard to control under certain conditions. That gets a cuteness 10, I'd say, that particular tactic. Some people have, well, one woman actually walked up to the governor of Arkansas, handcuffed herself to him and said, "I'm not leaving until you clean up the site in my community." There she was, handcuffed to the governor, denying that anyone was worked up about this issue, that it was outside agitators or something that was causing the problem. Well, that's maybe that's plan B. I don't know if that was plan A. Wherever the governor is. The tactics are so many. They're literally cookbooks. I'm sure we have some in back of the Toxis campaign that just describe all the different methods that are needed. But they all require the people to get involved and be there when someone calls, and really do the things that you promised to do. And as we found in Braintree, and as the people in Dayton, Massachusetts, who a few years ago were looking at a waste incinerator, or the people in Waltham, Massachusetts, when they were looking at a waste incinerator from Polaroid, they all found that in the end they can win. When people in Warren, Massachusetts stopped the IT corporation several years ago. All of these issues can be fought and won if enough people get involved. They really behave like a group with something in common.
Good point.
Can you give the people, paint a picture of what this landfill will look like
Oh,
above
gosh.
the ground? The aura, the dust, the noise.
That requires literacy, not just engineering skills here. How to present the aesthetic of a landfill. I've seen so many. I think that would be easy. I guess the first indication you have that you're getting close to a landfill is, you might be going through a pastoral countryside or an urban area, but you start to see, before anything else, the vacant lots. That's something that pops into my mind when I think of a facility like that, because, if you've got some empty space and you want to, say, start a business or a daycare center or something like that, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? Do you say, "I think I'll make it next to the landfill"?
Yeah.
No. So that's something that they pretty much have in common. You start to see underutilized land. The next thing depends on wind direction. How hot it is, how ripe the smell is going to be from the landfill. In some ways that's misleading though, because landfill sewage has a distinctive odor, but vinyl chloride, who knows the smell of vinyl chloride? Trichlorobenzene, oh come on, 2 people? That's actually very good. Diethyl phthalate ester, gotcha. Okay, diethyl phthalate ester is probably one of the largest volume toxic materials in the sludge. Who's going to know the smell when they go by the landfill? Nobody. Unless you happen to have a high-resolution capillary gas chromatograph mass spectrometer in your car, you're not going to be able to tell. You're going to have to take somebody's word for it. So again, odor is the next thing you're going to smell, but the toxics might already have been there doing their work before you ever notice the odor. Other thing you notice about a landfill, well, you feel like opening a ski shop when you see a landfill. Because everybody says, okay, we're going to make this landfill 30 feet high. We're going to dig down about 50 feet. We're going to put in 60 feet of fill, and we're going to put in 20 feet of cover on it. We're going to plant birch trees or something. But you know, landfills are awfully hard to come by. It's hard to find some town that wants to have a new landfill, so sooner or later, it's going to be full. So they're going to vertically expand your landfill. That's certainly something we've seen over and over again. You see a nice slope has been designed. You almost feel like you can build a golf course. You can put the 19th hole on top of this landfill. But when real life sets in, okay, cut down the birch trees, let's add another 30 feet. Let's add another 30 feet. No, there's no limit. There's no legal limit in this particular project how high this landfill can be. They promise the trees will be taller than the landfill. That won't help the groundwater, but when you drive by, there's a 50-50 chance that your relatives from out of town won't know that it's there if their noses are dead. But you also notice the incredibly steep slopes of a landfill. Has anyone driven by the intersection of 128 and 95 North lately? Anybody? Or maybe 24 going by Randolph? Let's see, what else? The Mass Turnpike by Chicopee. In all these cases, let's see, Rochester, Massachusetts, if you're coming from Acushnet, in all those places, what do you see? You see a slope that's like this. Evel Knievel wouldn't ski down that thing. I guess that's the last thing you're going to notice, well, almost the last thing you're going to notice about a landfill. Because just the steepness of the slopes that are required to get the height that they're going to need when no one buys their sludge pellets because they're too toxic. Other things, you're going to see little white PVC pipes sticking out of the ground, about yay high, 2 inches across. They'll have a padlock on it to prevent sabotage or something else. Those are the tops of monitoring wells that they're going to dig to try and get the contaminated groundwater and make lots of multicolored charts and maps and so on, showing where the leachate plume is headed. Last thing you'll notice about a landfill, I guarantee this one. I'm not speaking as a chemical engineer this time. Last thing you'll see around a landfill is going to be the for sale signs. And they'll be real old ones that have been out there for a while.
Could you discuss like birds, the rodents, and the methane gas?
Well, I'm not a toxicologist, so I really can't say too much about this. A landfill, birds. Have you seen everybody seen a fishing boat come back into port with all those seagulls on it? Same effect for a landfill. I mean, there's not much more to say with that. As far as other creatures, that stuff is actually attractive to a lot of our four-footed friends. One interesting thing about animals